My name is Charlie Pierce, and in cooperation with the Glendale Heritage Preservation, we would like to present to you my biographical history of one of Glendale's earliest residents, Daniel McLaren. People familiar with the village's history will know him as the Railroad Man. His home is still located on Greenville Avenue along the railroad tracks that run through the village of Glendale. Daniel McLaren was born on March the 3rd of 1821 in Perth, Scotland in the Scottish Highlands. His parents were Daniel McLaren and Marjorie Crawford. The family's ancestors were farmers for generations. Daniel grew up in this same farm life, but in his later years, while still in school, he began to show an interest and the aptitude to become a mechanic. After finishing school, he got a job as a mechanic's apprentice. All his focus was now on this field of work. After a couple of years, he completed his training and received an apprenticeship in Dundee. With these new skills, he found work with the local railroad. As a mechanic, his skills allowed him to work on railroad locomotives. Once, though, during a conversation with a female relative who had just returned from visiting America, she told him of the country's beauty and their railroads and the opportunities that might be there for him. After a very short time, he convinced himself he should move from Scotland and travel across the Atlantic to America. In 1843, he was 22 years old. He decided to leave home. He traveled to Liverpool, England, and he boarded the ship Shakespeare and headed to New York City in America. After a few months and a rough trip at sea, the ship finally landed in New York Harbor. Daniel set foot in America with only the clothes on his back and a few souvenirs in his pockets from home. With the skills he had been taught, it didn't take long to find employment, though. He immediately found a job with a railroad in New York City. He was employed as a mechanic. This railroad company's road ran from New York City to Boston, the Falls River, and back again to Boston and New York. One day back in New York City, while exploring the city, Daniel noticed a mechanic in a rail yard working on a locomotive. This mechanic was attempting to remove the main drive wheel off a locomotive. Daniel noticed him struggling to remove it. He also noticed this man wasn't following the process for removal the way Daniel had been taught during his apprenticeship. So Daniel walked up to the man and he suggested the way he had learned to remove the wheel. The man accepted his advice and they did the process the way Daniel instructed him. The wheel came right off. The mechanic was so surprised that a young man of Daniel's age would have the skills to do such work. The mechanic alerted his supervisor of Daniel's skills, and Daniel was immediately hired by this new railroad company. Daniel quickly caught the eye of the superintendent of this new railroad. His name was William Parker, and he took Daniel under his wing. This was the beginning of Daniel's career as a railroad man. From this position, Daniel began to move up the ladder. He quickly went from mechanic to locomotive engineer. With his mentor, he was taught how to operate a railroad company. As an engineer, his new route was from Boston to Worcester and back. He held this position for a couple of years. While talking with other railroaders, Daniel began to hear stories of a new railroad being constructed in the West. He heard of a new opportunity in Cincinnati, Ohio. He started to think about moving out west. Meanwhile, back in Boston, his work ethic and his name were becoming familiar around town. In fact, the Boston Advertiser, in a news article they published about the B&W Railroad and Daniel McLaren, they wrote of him, he is a superior mechanic and had great nerve and probably was the most possessed man on the road. Shortly afterwards, his mentor, William Parker, announced his resignation. That was the nudge that Daniel needed, and he also resigned and planned to go to Cincinnati, Ohio. He was accompanied on this trip by two other railroad men he had been working with at the B&W, F. H. Short and John Collins. All three in later years would become identified with building this new railroad in Ohio. After arriving in Cincinnati, all three were hired by this new railroad, the Cincinnati Hamilton Dayton Railroad. Once again, Daniel's skills immediately attracted the attention of the railroad's president. This was the beginning of a new career in the West. The year was 1849, and Daniel had only lived in America for 4.5 years. Upon his arrival in Cincinnati, the railroad was already in process of construction. His connection to this railroad would continue from this beginning until shortly before his death in 1875. During this time, he rose from a master mechanic to a railroad engineer to a superintendent and then to a vice president and next the president. In addition, he became the general superintendent of another newly formed railroad company, the Atlantic and Great Western, now the New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio Railroad. In 1851, upon the completion of the CHD Railroad, he was given the honor of running the first locomotive on the new road from Cincinnati to Carthage. After this achievement, he took the position of manager of another new road, the Marietta, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland Railroad. This would be his last position. During his time as a railroad man, he was considered a person of great character. He was known to have superior management skills while operating railroad companies. He had the great ability to repair and run locomotives and keep them running. He also possessed vast knowledge of supervising all railroad businesses. He was a counselor and a leader on the railroad's board of directors. He was known to have a particular passion for the adventurous life of the engineer. He once said, "It was like commanding a ship, leading a battle charge, or directing a storm. It was realizing triumph over ever occurring obstacles." He had become a force to reckon with, hence his superiority over common men. But Daniel was also known for his acts of kindness and charity. He showed sympathy for the less fortunate. He contributed to many charities. He was a member of the First Congregational Church of Cincinnati, and he aided this church. After building his home in Glendale, which was completed in 1868, he became a major contributor to the construction of the new Presbyterian Church in Glendale, and he was a great supporter of his ministers. On December 1st of 1852, he married Miss Amelia E. Jenkins. She was the daughter of Z. Platt, Esquire, in Cincinnati. Their home would be in the 15th Ward near downtown Cincinnati. They had 2 children, both boys. There was also a daughter from Mrs. Jenkins' first marriage. The oldest son, Daniel E., was born on April 22nd of 1855 in Cincinnati. The second son, John Platt, was born on February the 10th of 1857, also in Cincinnati. The stepdaughter's name was Frances R. Jenkins, who later became the wife of S.A. McLaren, who would become the mayor of Glendale in 1876. In 1865, Daniel McLaren began building his new home in Glendale. It is located on a small hill overlooking the road on which the CH&D Railroad passes through the village. It is on Greenville Avenue. Their home was built by another village resident, Daniel DeCamp, a well-known Cincinnati architect who had already built himself a home in Glendale. Both homes are very much the same. McLaren's home is a 2-story brick building. The front door is made from heavily carved walnut. Inside, it is complete with 12-foot plaster ceilings, walnut staircases, marquee tree floors, and marble mantels. The house was completed in 1868. The home is still, to this day, beautiful, with little change from its original appearance. It still shows its wealth and refinement. Inside, Mr. McLaren had a large library built, where he kept his lifetime collection of books on many subjects. He loved to read. It is said the collection had over 2,000 volumes. The death of Daniel McLaren came in September the 9th of 1875. It produced a profound sensation in the business and the social circles around southwestern Ohio. His funeral was one of the largest in Cincinnati to this day. The railroad provided his family with 21 passenger cars to carry him, his friends, and his business associates. Included followers of the IOOF and the Masonic fraternities. The train stopped in Glendale and loaded as many people on it as it could hold, but not everyone could fit. So the railroad transferred 7 more cars from Dayton and Hamilton. All were filled to full. The Dayton delegation was accompanied by the Knights Templar Band. The Glendale delegation was accompanied by the Dramatic Band. The tracks were thronged in Glendale with people on both sides. It was said there were 1,000 or more people gathered around the depot in the square. Many were employees of the railroad, but most were just his friends. Hundreds were in the streets of Glendale and on his front lawn. The Reverend W. H. Babin, pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Glendale, conducted the ceremonies on the front yard. When the prayers, the singings, and the readings of the scriptures were complete, the other clergymen each delivered a short address of the life of Daniel McLaren. After closing statements, Daniel's body was wheeled down to the train in front of his house. He was placed in the express car near the front of the train. The following were the pallbearers: H. W. Hughes, Robert Clark, F. H. Short, J. W. Hartwell, William Cullen, John H. Wheeler. Also from the IOOF, Henry E. Porter and John P. Moore. From the Masonic Lodge was Thomas McLean and Henry Kessler. From the Lafayette Blue Lodge was Charles Brown and John E. Bell. And from the Knights Templar, John Evans and Henry Martin. It was estimated the train from Glendale carried over 2,000 people to Spring Grove Cemetery. The train was pulled by the most powerful locomotive the railroad owned, and they named it the Daniel McLaren. It was draped in mourning. With this great load, the train moved slowly towards the cemetery, and the length of it was 30 cars. Upon finally reaching the public vaults at the cemetery, a short service was held by each of the community service representatives. At the close of these ceremonies, a Scottish rite was conducted, the presentation of a ring of the deceased. This ring was usually presented to the deceased's dearest friend. This presentation was given by E.T. Carlson, but it was presented to Daniel McLaren, Jr., his oldest son. After which, the body was placed in the public vault at Spring Grove Cemetery.